Well, hello everyone. This is Mike Howard, and I am here with,
Beverly Howard.
and we're going to do a Bible study. This is our 26th and final lesson in the book of Genesis.
Oh, it's all over.
Yeah, we're wrapping up today. Next week, we're starting 26 more lessons on the book of Acts. That's the study of the early church. And so I hope that you'll join us for that study as well. But I think you'll enjoy today's lesson as we get finished with our study in the book of Genesis. I think for me, this lesson is a great lesson to those people, perhaps that you know, that struggle with accepting the gospel story. One of the responses that I get sometimes when I try to explain it is, that's just too good to be true. How Jesus died for me and that I then am forgiven, and that just is too good to be true. Well, in today's story, we're going to find an example of God's grace being too good to be true. So, at least for the family of Jacob. So, get ready. Here we go. Title of the lesson is Revenge with a question mark. So, that's an interesting title. So, today we're wrapping up Genesis. Chapters 1 through 11, we dealt with God. In the beginning, God created the earth, okay, and the heavens and the earth. And then went through the creation story, the fall resulting from eating from the fruit of the forbidden tree, and then the promise, God's promise to Adam and Eve that one of their descendants would crush the serpent's head, which is the first time we hear about God's plan for the Messiah. And then we have the story of the flood, Noah and the flood, and how God starts over again. And then we finish up the first 11 chapters with a very interesting story that really tees up the rest of the Bible, and that is the story of the Tower of Babel. It's man's attempt to reach up to restore a relationship with God, and that's just not possible. We can't achieve that, and I think that figures into the whole grace is too good to be true story. We feel like we've got to do something to earn this salvation. And that's really what the people in chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel were trying to do. So God says, no, we're not going to do it that way. I've got a different plan. My plan's better. And he starts off his plan in chapter 12 and takes us all the way through the end of Genesis chapter 50, today's lesson, where he implements the plan to start with a man named Abram, who later becomes Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and his son Jacob, and then his 12 sons. And we're going to focus, as we have been for the last several weeks, on one of those sons whose name is Joseph. So it's the story of Joseph. 25% of the whole book of Genesis is about the story of Joseph. Wow, it's big. Okay, he is Jacob's dearly loved son from the wife who he dearly loved, Rachel. And he is, as we all know from these lessons, he has been rejected by his brothers. They were jealous of him, so they threw him into a pit and then later sold him into slavery. He went to Egypt as a slave, was sold into the house of Potiphar, where his wife accused him of trying to rape her, and then Potiphar threw him into prison. And then after he had been there for several years, he interprets a dream from the baker and the cupbearer, and we see that was one of the lessons that talked about the forgiveness that comes through the offering of blood. And then he has an opportunity, because of that story, to interpret two dreams from Pharaoh. And after he interprets those dreams of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, Pharaoh decides to put Joseph in command, in charge of going through the next 14 years in Egypt. So he now becomes second in command only to Pharaoh. So he sits at the right hand of Pharaoh. And he says that his role, as he describes it later, is this was God's plan to save many lives, and also his whole family, the family of Israel. So it has a lot of parallels to God's plan through Jesus Christ. This is a shadow of that plan. So we're going to start today. The lesson is quite short. It's in the 50th chapter, the last chapter, but I'll bring everybody up to speed with me on what happens between last week's lesson and chapter 50. Well, in chapter 46, remember, Joseph has a reunion with his brothers. They make up. There's a lot of weeping that goes on. And then Joseph tells his brothers to go back and get Jacob and the rest of the family and bring them to Egypt where they can weather the famine so they won't die. And so on the way down, so the brothers go back. They tell Jacob the good news that Joseph's alive and that we're all going to move to Egypt so we can survive. And Jacob, of course, has been promised the promised land. He's a little reluctant to leave, but God gives him a vision. And in that vision, he says, it's okay. Don't be afraid to go. I will be with you, and I will bring you back again. So remember that statement there. So Jacob and Joseph then, once Jacob gets all the way down to Egypt, to the land of Goshen, he and Joseph have the most wonderful reunion of 20 years of Jacob thinking that Joseph was dead and Joseph not knowing what had happened to his dad. So it was a beautiful story in chapter 46 and 47. Joseph brings Jacob and several of his brothers to meet Pharaoh. And when he's there, this is a pretty interesting side, Jacob actually blesses Pharaoh. And that's kind of cool because in the Bible, the greater is the one who blesses the lesser. And here is Pharaoh, king of the world, being blessed by basically a shepherd, an old shepherd man. And I thought that was just pretty cool. Yes. So Jacob then asks Joseph, because Jacob now, after 17 years, Jacob, of course, is going to die. And at this point, he has asked Joseph to promise him that he would take his body back to Canaan and bury him there in Canaan. So that would happen in about 17 years. The famine continues for 5 more years. In chapter 48, Jacob is about to die. He's now 140, I think it's 47 years old. And so Joseph brings his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, in to see his father before he dies. And as they come in, Jacob blesses them. But instead of blessing Ephraim, because Ephraim's instead of blessing Manasseh, because Manasseh is the older son, he reaches his right hand across to Ephraim and he blesses Ephraim. And even though Joseph says, no, Dad, don't do it that way. This one's older. Jacob says, no, this is the right way. Ephraim will become a great nation. As a matter of fact, Ephraim became, as far as the tribes were concerned, the largest tribe. They had a large group of people both to the east and to the west of the Jordan River. And actually, in many cases later on, the northern kingdom, that would be the northern 10 tribes, were often referred to as Ephraim. So that's how powerful Ephraim became because of this blessing that he was given. Okay, but it wasn't that Manasseh wasn't blessed. He was blessed as well. But Manasseh actually became a much smaller tribe. So in chapter 49, Jacob then has died. And so, before he dies, he calls all of his sons in, and he goes in birth order, starting with Reuben, and he tells them about their future, about the future of their descendants. It doesn't say that he calls them in to bless them. It says he calls them in to tell them what will happen. So this is going to be it's a blessing, but it's a prophetic blessing. It's prophecy. It's a word from the Lord to them. And he tells Reuben and Simeon and Levi that their future is not going to be that bright. Reuben, because he slept with one of Jacob's wives, Simeon and Levi, because of what they did to all the men in Shechem when they murdered them with the sword. So now he's said that to the first 3 sons, and then he gets to the 4th son, and that's where it really gets beautiful, with Judah, he says this about Judah's future. The scepter, and the scepter is something that a ruler holds, of course. It's their mark of them being the king, that and the crown, the scepter and the crown. The scepter, Jacob says, will not depart from Judah, Judah meaning the tribe of Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. And between his feet indicates the lineage, okay, the children that will become, and the children of the children and the children, so the descendants, okay. The ruler's staff will not depart from his feet until he, that's Jesus, to whom it belongs, shall come, and the obedience of the nations then shall be Jesus, be his. It'll be his. So it's a huge prophecy. It's a prophecy that was started early in Genesis when God told Adam and Eve that one of their descendants was going to crush the head of the serpent. And here it is. It shows up here as a prophecy that descendant is actually going to come from the tribe of Judah. The line of Judah, as we know, is Jesus. Now we're finally, after the review, in chapter 50, and the brothers are going to fear that Joseph is going to do something bad to them out of revenge. Now, they fear this because now their father, who they kind of thought was, standing between them and Joseph's anger or his revenge, is now gone. And they've traveled up to Canaan, all of the brothers did, and they buried the father there. And now they're back in Egypt. And so now it's funny that they would go back to Egypt because the famine is now over, because 17 years, the famine's been over probably 12 years at this point. And yet life is so good. Goshen is so beautiful and full of wonderful grass that I guess they've just decided that they're going to stay there. And that prediction was actually made back when God spoke it to Abram. He said that your descendants are going to go to a foreign land and be there for 400 years, and he was speaking of Egypt. So Joseph is now a very powerful man. Of course, he's still number 2 to Pharaoh. Jacob has just died, and now the brothers fear that Joseph will seek revenge for all that they've done to him, throwing him in the pit, selling him into slavery, telling their father that he had been killed by a wild animal. So we're going to pick up the story in verse 15. Fear of revenge. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him?" They're still feeling guilty. Now, let's think a little bit about this. Jacob lived 17 years after they came back down to Egypt. So this is 17 years of living in Egypt with their brother Joseph. After they had the big reunion, remember a couple of weeks ago, where they wept and they hugged each other, and Joseph explained that it was God's will for all this to happen so that many would be saved, and it was a beautiful, beautiful, kind of weepy kind of time. 17 years goes by where Joseph is making sure that they're all taken care of, and now that Jacob is dead, all of a sudden they're afraid. What if Joseph pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him 40-something years ago? So they're going to send a message. They're afraid to address Joseph face to face. So they're going to send a letter to Joseph. And in this letter, it says, they send word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died." Not our father, not Daddy Jacob, your father. They're just making sure he understands, okay, before he died. And then, your father said this to us. This is what you are to say to Joseph. "I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs that they committed in treating you so badly." This sounds like something they just kind of made up to me, but what if it was true? Okay, so this is a message to Joseph, the son, from the father who has now died. I want you to ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. And it's from the Father, supposedly, to the Son, but it sounds an awful lot like another message from the Son to the Father. In Luke 23, as Jesus was hanging on the cross, suffering to die, Jesus said, one of the last things he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And they continued to divide up his clothes by casting lots. So one case, it's a message from the Father to the Son to forgive. In the other case, it's from the Son to the Father to forgive. So when Joseph gets this message, he does something unusual. Now, please, this is the rest of the message. Please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him and he read it, Joseph wept. Now, the first question you got to ask is, why would Joseph weep when he reads this message? And we're not told. So that gives me a little bit of freedom to tell you my opinion. And my opinion is this. Joseph explained when they had the big reunion that it was okay. That they had sold him into slavery, and it was okay. They treated him badly and put him in the pit because this was just part of God's plan. And it's resulted in the salvation of many. Yes. So he told them that 17 years ago. And here we are after living with Joseph for 17 years and really being the beneficiary of all that Joseph has given to them, a place to live, grain to eat, a place for their livestock to pasture, treated them extremely well, very kind to them. 17 years of that graciousness from Joseph, and this is where their hearts still are. And that would cause Joseph to weep. How could they think, after all these years, after all of what I've done for them, after me explaining to them the whole point of me being here in Egypt, being part of God's plans, how could they even think that I would seek revenge? So that's my opinion.
That's good.
So verse 18, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before Joseph, and they said to Joseph, "We are your slaves." But Joseph said back to them, Don't be afraid. And am I in the place of God? God has chosen to forgive. And he repeats what he said to them 17 years earlier. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That's God's grace. So then he says, don't be afraid. I will provide the same way in the future that I provided in the past 17 years. I will provide for you and your children. Joseph reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. And now we get to the epitaph of the story of Joseph's life, but don't forget that last thing that Joseph did, because it comes back in the summary and the application. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family, all his brothers, and he lived for 110 years. So long that Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, so his grandson's children, were placed on his knees when they were born. So he got to live long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren. Verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, same way that Jacob had said to Joseph when he was about to die, he said, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid. Remember when he said that? And he will take you up, you being your descendants, take you up out of this land, that would be 400 years, 430 years to be precise, to the land that he promised, the promised land. On oath, he made that promise on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So verse 25, Joseph made the Israelites, This would be really the sons and the grandsons of his brothers and any brothers that were still alive. Made the Israelites swear an oath and say, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. And God will surely come to your aid, of course, refers to Moses, and you will have to take my bones up. And it's interesting, verse 26, so Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they had embalmed him, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes I get questions from new Christians, and they say, I was planning on being cremated. Do you think that's okay with God if I'm cremated? And I, it just doesn't matter, I don't think. Once again, my opinion is it doesn't matter. The Jews were not embalmed. They wrapped him, a Jew that had died, they wrapped him up and put him in the tomb and put ointments and spices so their body wouldn't stink up the place. But in Egypt, the custom was to embalm. And today's many people still are embalmed. But I don't think it matters what you do to your body. God is going to raise it as a new body. That's my opinion. Summary of Genesis. In chapter 11, God thwarts man's attempt to reach up to him. But then in chapter 12, God launches his plan to reach down to man by choosing the family of Abram to come out of Babylon into a land that he promised them, and that Abram would be the line from which the Messiah would be born. This path of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Judah, and then so forth, this path and this promise continues through Isaac and Jacob, and it culminates with evil that's inflicted on their brother Joseph. But God uses this evil to provide salvation to all Israel. But for some reason, and I think it's a human reason, it's the same reason that in chapter 11 they tried to build a tower up to God. For some reason, man, humans, you, me, we struggle to accept forgiveness. Somehow or other, it just doesn't seem like justice is being served. If we've done something wrong, it just seems like justice says that crime, that sin must be paid back. And that's really the story of Jesus. That's the story of the cross. He died a death as an innocent man so that you and I, who are not innocent, can be forgiven. But that's a struggle. That's a struggle for us to understand. It's hard for us to receive a gift like that. And as Christians, as we grow in our faith, as the Holy Spirit starts revealing to us the areas in our lives that are dark, that need to be transformed, as we start to see those areas of sin, we're going to develop a lot of guilt. And we're going to be very sorrowful, that godly sorrow that we talked about a few weeks ago. And when we do develop that guilt and that sorrow, it's going to be hard for us to accept God's grace. And that's where this lesson is such a great example. Joseph's brothers intended to do evil to him when he was 17. They lived with a lie to their father for 20 years, knowing that Joseph hadn't been killed, that he was now a slave in Egypt. And 17 years after they reunite with their brother, they still live in fear that justice hasn't been served, a fear of revenge. So how do we apply that to our lives? Well, who can understand grace? Nobody. Nobody can understand God's grace. As we get older in our faith, we begin to see more and more and understand more and more, but it still is such a mystery to us. Why? The God of the universe would forgive your sins and mine. It's just amazing. Therefore, it's amazing grace. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, for it is by God's grace that you have been saved through faith, believing that this gift is for you, and that this is faith is not from yourselves. It's this grace, this thing, this salvation. It's a gift of God. It's not by works, chapter 11 in Genesis. You can't build it up so that you can't boast about it. You just have to receive it. And after 37 years, his sons, Jacob's sons, still couldn't believe it. So who can understand grace? Well, one definition is God's riches for you at Christ's expense. See, acrostic spells grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. Well, in this case, Joseph then becomes the most beautiful example of God's grace because it's God's riches for Israel at Joseph's expense. And just as it was difficult for Joseph's brothers to feel forgiven, it is difficult sometimes for us. It started out like this in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Do not seek revenge or don't bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Remember when they asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was? He says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, body, everything you've got. And oh, by the way, the second command is like that. Love your neighbor as yourself. And God ends this verse by saying, because I am the Lord, and I'm going to demonstrate why. Colossians 3:12, Paul makes it very, very clear. As God's chosen people, that's you who've believed by faith, and that's me. As God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, you should then clothe yourself with compassion, kindness. These are
Put it on.
these are things that we get to clothe ourselves with. Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So wear all of those garments of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other. Forgive each other. If any one of you has a grievance against someone, look, you should forgive them, give them grace the same way that God has forgiven you, given you grace. And that's going to be the measure of how much you understand or don't understand God's grace. It's how you're able to forgive, or maybe perhaps you aren't. And then he finishes it up. Paul finishes it up in verse 14. He says, look, you've put on all of these virtues, this compassion and the kindness and all this forgiveness. You've put on all these virtues, but on top of all that is an overcoat. On top of all of those virtues, put on love, because that love is going to bind all of these virtues together in perfect unity. And here's the lesson for me and for you. If there's a fear that you have of punishment, it needs to be replaced by the peace that comes from grace. Forgiveness through Christ. We don't deserve it. We didn't earn it. God gave it. It's hard to accept, but by faith, we must. Pray with me. Father, your grace is amazing, as the song says. But as we go about our daily lives, we're so tempted to feel like we're just guilty, and there's no way you could love us because of things that we've done. There's no way you could forgive us because of all that we've done and ways that we've disappointed both you and others. And yet, in the same way that Joseph wept, I'm sure Jesus weeps for us. Just accept grace. It's God's forgiveness, and it's because of what God did through Christ. And in the case of this story, it's because of what God did through Joseph. It's an example to us of your grace. God, as we go on this journey of getting mature, becoming mature, being transformed, continue to show us and convince us that you still love us, that your grace is forever for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
What a way to finish Genesis, huh? Well, next week we start with the new church in Acts chapter 1. See you next week. Still in, stay safe, know that we love you. Bye-bye.
Bye.